Hello and welcome to Eye Opening. This is episode 2, where we will be talking about measuring success, the science of assessment-based practices. We are your hosts for today's episode. My name is Kassidy Martinez. I am a second-year grad student in the Master's in Industrial Organizational Psychology at San Francisco State University, and I will be graduating in May of 2025.
Hi, I'm Jennifer Alvarado, and I am also a second-year student studying IO psychology at SFSU, and I'm looking forward to diving into the science of workplace assessments today.
Today, we will be covering why workplace assessment matters in modern organizations. We're also going to be discussing selection, organizational assessment, and performance reviews. We will briefly cover training, but we'll leave the majority of that topic for our fellow podcast hosts, Nico and Monica, who will take a deep dive into training on another episode. Jen, would you like to tell us a little bit about the foundation of workplace assessment?
Yes, Kassidy, I'd be happy to. So we want to start off this episode by going over the history of workplace assessments and the key principles of what truly makes a good assessment. Workplace assessments have evolved over time, and its foundations are rooted in personnel selection and psychological evaluation. They can be traced all the way to being used in World War I by the U.S. military. They developed a merit rating system in order to identify which soldiers should be discharged or transferred based on their performance. This was the first use of systematic employee evaluation, paving the way for it to be used in corporate America. By the 1960s, most companies had adopted assessments.
Wow, that's actually really cool to be able to trace the use of testing all the way back to World War I.
I know, right? Now, just to give a little bit of a timeline, by the 1980s, inflation rates went up and companies began to award pay with positive appraisals, leading many of them to reward high and middle performers and get rid of low performers. Now, this worked for a while, but over time, many organizations began to grow, making it more difficult for managers to invest time in developing the assessments. In 2011, a company named Kelly Services completely got rid of performance assessments because they believed it emphasized frequent informal feedback. After this major company dropped assessments, over the next few years, companies such as Deloitte and PwC followed and decided to focus more on developmental feedback rather than numerical.
That's interesting.
Yeah, that's exactly what I thought when I was doing my research. Okay, so now that we know a little bit about the history of workplace assessments, let's move on to the key principles of what makes a good assessment. According to our research, a good assessment should have reliability, validity, fairness, and legal compliance. So let's break down each of these principles. Let's think of reliability like using a scale to weigh yourself. If you step on the scale 3 times in a row and get the same number each time, that scale is reliable. In assessments, reliability means that the results are consistent no matter when or how the test is taken. It's about trust. If the results jump around for no reason, it's not reliable. Let's move on to validity. Now imagine you're trying to find out how strong you are, but instead of lifting weights, someone asks you to solve a math problem. Now that test wouldn't make sense, right? That's because it's not valid for measuring strength. Validity means the assessment actually measures what it's supposed to do. If you're testing for creativity, the test should include creative tasks, not random trivia. Now fairness, one of my favorite principles of assessment, is all about leveling the playing field. A good assessment shouldn't give one group of people an advantage over another. Think about if a job interview had questions that only people from one specific background would understand. That wouldn't be fair. Fairness ensures everyone has an equal chance to show what they're capable of, no matter who they are. Lastly, we have legal compliance, which essentially means we need to follow the rules. Legal compliance is like playing by the rules of the game. There are some laws that protect people from being treated unfairly in assessments. For example, things like anti-discrimination laws. A good assessment follows these rules to make sure it doesn't violate anyone's rights. It's not just about doing what's ethical, it's about doing what's lawful. So to wrap it up, a good assessment is reliable, valid, fair, and legal. When all of these principles are in place, you can trust the process and the results.
Thanks for breaking this down for us. This did make me wonder if there are any myths or misconceptions individuals may have about assessments.
Great question, Kassidy. I can briefly touch on 2 common myths and misconceptions about workplace assessments. Did you know that one of the most common misconceptions is that many think they are reliable single-event sign-off tools, when in fact they are designed for ongoing learning and feedback? Assessments aren't just about giving a thumbs up or thumbs down after one event. They're meant to be part of an ongoing process, a way to learn and grow over time. Think of them more like a fitness tracker than a final exam. A fitness tracker doesn't just tell you if you're fit or not, it shows your progress, highlights areas you can improve, and helps you build better habits. That's what good assessments do. They provide feedback to help you get better, not just stamp you with a grade and call it a day. So instead of seeing them as a single sign-off, think of them as tools for your journey, designed to support you in learning, growth, and development over time.
Oh, wow. I actually was not aware of this misconception.
Same here. So one more common myth I found in my research is that many people think they're designed to trick you. A lot of folks assume these assessments are full of confusing questions meant to catch you off guard or make you fail. But here's the truth. That's not how good assessments work at all. Assessments aren't like a pop quiz in school where the teacher's trying to see if you read one specific paragraph. Instead, they're designed to reflect your true abilities, strengths, and even areas where you might need some improvement. The goal isn't to stump you, it's to understand you. It's to help both you and the company figure out if this job is the right fit for you. It's not just about whether you can do the job, but also whether you'd enjoy it and thrive in that role. So next time you face an assessment, remember it's not trying to trick you, it's a tool to help you and the company figure out where you shine and how you can grow in that role.
Thank you for sharing those, Jen. I think they're very important misconceptions to be aware of, especially when one is designing an assessment.
Yeah, I definitely agree, but this has led me to think about personnel selection tools we can use. Kassidy, do you happen to know of any?
Yeah, I'd be happy to go over them.
Awesome.
Okay, so let's get into personnel selection tools. This section will cover structured interviews, cognitive assessments, personality assessments, pitfalls to avoid, quick tips, success stories, and lastly, cost-benefit analysis. First, let's talk about structured interviews. Structured interviews are increasingly popular for employee selection due to their improved psychometric properties compared to traditional interview methods. Structured interviews have shown effectiveness in team-based settings, with social skills, personality traits, and teamwork knowledge predicting how the candidate will eventually perform in the positions they're being interviewed for. So let me actually pause here for a sec. Before we get into the specifics on structured interviews, I think it's also a good idea to tackle what an unstructured interview is. That way we can all know the difference. Unstructured interviews are basically conversations where there are no fixed questions ahead of time.
So it's more of a free-flowing chat.
Exactly. And the direction of the interview can really depend on how the candidate responds. For example, the interviewer might ask things like, "What's a book you've read recently?" Or, "Can you talk about your research?" But these aren't meant to pinpoint specific traits of the applicant, and the questions can vary a lot between candidates. Because these interviews are more relaxed, they can sometimes lead to questions that are biased or even illegal. Plus, without a clear way to score answers, there's a lot more room for personal bias in how responses are interpreted. As a result, unstructured interviews aren't always the most reliable or valid way to assess someone.
Oh, I see. So what I'm getting is that unstructured interviews can be inconsistent because there's no guidelines to follow. Makes sense. Okay, so what are structured interviews?
Okay, so unlike the unstructured interview, structured interviews use standardized questions that are written prior to an interview, are behaviorally or situationally focused, are asked of every candidate, and are scored using an established rubric. Okay, so what are all these components? Let's break each one down. Behavioral questions ask the candidate to respond about a prior experience of theirs, which can provide insight into how the candidate might behave in the future. These kinds of questions can also show the knowledge, priorities, and values of the candidate and are specifically asked to reflect qualities the company is looking for. For example, a behavioral question could ask, "Give an example where you experienced X, Y, and Z and describe how you handled that situation."
Okay, so behavioral questions ask about an experience they already had. Gotcha. Yeah, I've been asked those kinds of questions plenty of times in interviews. So what are situational questions?
Well, these require an applicant to predict how they would act in a hypothetical situation and are intended to reflect a realistic scenario the applicant may encounter during their employment. The answers they give will show us what their priorities and values are. Some examples of situational questions are, "What would you do if you received sole credit for something you worked on with a colleague?" Or, "What would you do if you witnessed a colleague showing microaggression toward another colleague?" These questions can provide insight into the characteristics of the candidate, such as integrity and incivility.
Oh, I've also been asked these types of questions too. I've always wondered why they ask hypothetical questions like that. Now I know. Okay, so tell us more about structured interviews.
Structured interviews also eliminate biases, such as halo, horn, and affinity bias. Let me break down these three biases for you real quick, though. Halo, horn, and affinity biases are just some of the cognitive biases that can really mess with decision making, especially in workplaces. There are plenty more kinds of biases, but for now, I'll cover 3. So affinity bias is when you tend to favor people who are similar to you, such as sharing a hometown or alma mater, which can really hurt efforts to promote diversity and inclusion if gone unchecked. The halo and horn effects are when your overall positive or negative feelings about someone spill over into how you judge their individual qualities. Specifically, the halo effect is taking someone's positive characteristic and ignoring any other information that may contradict this positive perception. And the horn effect is taking negative characteristics and ignoring any other information that may contradict this negative perception. Basically, if you like someone, you might think everything they do is great, which is the halo effect. And if you don't like them, you might assume the worst about everything they do, which is the horn effect. These biases tamper with your judgment and can make it harder to make rational, objective decisions. That's why they're so important for managers and organizations to be aware of.
What's interesting about these biases is that I think everyone has experienced making small talk with the interviewer. It's very likely that you're going to find similarities with someone when you're talking to them. So are you saying small talk is not allowed at all?
Funny you bring that up. So that's actually leading into the topic I'll discuss next, which is interviewer training. Okay, so what is that? It's training interviewers on how to interview, how to score candidates' responses to questions, how to maintain an appropriate attitude, and how to avoid biases, which can all ensure that the interview is reliable. This ultimately leads to improved inter-rater agreements, aka making sure that more than one person comes to the same conclusion, and reduced biases, compared to traditional non-structured interviews.
Okay. So if the interviewer is properly trained to conduct interviews, then they will know how to navigate around biases. And basically, the interview will yield objective information about the candidate.
Exactly. And that's what you want out of the selection process, so you can pick the best person for the job. So now I want to talk about something real quick, which is a scoring rubric for applicant responses. The scoring of each question is important as it helps define what makes a high-performing versus low-performing answer. In other words, what's a good answer to the question, what's a poor answer to the question, and what's an answer that is in the middle. Once a scoring rubric is established, interviewers can be trained to review the questions, score applicant responses, and ensure they do not revise the questions during the interview.
So having a rubric and interviewer training ensures that biases are reduced. Are there other methods to reduce biases?
Yeah. So as I briefly touched on earlier, another way to reduce biases is to have multiple interviewers, which also contributes to increased diversity in selection. In other words, having a hiring team rather than one hiring staff member making all of the judgment calls is the way to go. Also, when you have multiple interviews with different interviewers, it gives you the chance to ask the candidate a wider range of questions. Plus, it helps balance out any biases from individual interviewers, which makes the scoring more consistent and improves the ability to predict how successful the applicant will be in the prospective role. Not to mention, it's a wise idea to use the same group of interviewers for all candidates, as this reduces the chance of scoring differences between, say, different staff members.
Gotcha, that makes sense. So with this method of multiple interviewers, you minimize the chance of, let's say, one recruiter's skewed opinion of an applicant being the end-all be-all for the job applicant. It's not just up to one recruiter if the applicant gets hired or not.
That's exactly right. And these structured interview formats can be applied to virtual interviews as well as in-person interviews. The virtual format may also allow for further interview innovation. For example, you can record an interview conducted on Zoom to review at a later time. So we're going to switch gears here and talk about cognitive assessments. Cognitive ability tests look at general cognitive ability, specific abilities, knowledge, and non-cognitive traits. They're commonly used as a selection tool because they're good at predicting job performance, also known as how good someone will be at their job. With that being said, one thing to keep in mind is that they can also have a negative impact on minority candidates. And trying to make these tests fairer across different groups could actually make them less accurate at predicting who will do well in the job, which can end up making the hiring process less effective. So it's really important to use the right test for the right purpose alongside any other useful tools that are recommended by IO researchers and IO practitioners.
Huh, interesting. So you mentioned another kind of test too, right?
Right. So over time, selection testing has focused on both cognitive abilities and personality traits. So personality assessments are used to determine if candidates possess certain qualities that are important for the job. For example, the Big Five personality model is currently the standard approach for personality testing, as it is commonly accepted as the most valid personality test. This test looks at 5 traits, which are extroversion, agreeableness, conscientiousness, openness to experience, and emotional stability. Like I mentioned earlier, parts of the hiring process can help predict how the candidates will perform later in their positions. For example, a study by Barrick and Mount found that how conscientious people were was a good way to predict if they'd perform well at their jobs. The researchers also concluded that extroversion was a good way to tell how successful someone would be in managerial and sales positions. So now that we've covered the components of the selection process, let's highlight some real-world success stories.
Ooh, I love stuff like this.
Good, because I'm about to talk about 2 companies that I think we'll all recognize. So, in 2016, Unilever implemented technology to digitally automate its North America entry-level hiring process from the resume screen to the final round in-person interview. Once candidates get past the resume screen, they spend 20 minutes playing 12 neuroscience-based games created by a science-based recruitment platform. When applicants do well on these, they move on to a video interview via HireVue, where they record responses to preset questions. HireVue analyzes and scores tone, body language, and keywords. The highest cumulative scoring candidates receive final round in-person interview invitations. My other example is Procter & Gamble. So every candidate globally must take 2 assessments, a personality test to assess culture fit, followed by an adaptive reasoning test. Questions are frequently recalibrated to better predict how successful candidates will be in the position and remove biases based on demographics. Since implementing these methods, Procter & Gamble has seen increases in candidate diversity and volume. Specifically, over 1 million applicants per year for 10,000 full-time and intern roles, and the fewest number of available positions in recent history due to more successful job matching.
Wow, it's really cool to see how IO is used in practice.
I know, right? It gives grad students like us an idea of what we can be doing professionally once we graduate. But I digress. Let's talk about some common pitfalls to avoid regarding assessments. First, regarding interviews, avoid solely asking open-ended questions as they lack a structure for the candidate to answer with. Secondly, we definitely do not want to exacerbate a candidate's negative experience during the interview stage. We can do our due diligence by ensuring the interviewers are properly trained to conduct interviews. Third, while assessments are helpful, we don't want to cognitively overload candidates by making them answer countless questions on a survey, referred to as survey fatigue.
You know, I'm glad you covered this because I know I've taken surveys before that lasted way too long.
I know, right? This is all stuff you have to consider when you're putting people through this process. And lastly, we want to avoid having candidates complete stages of the selection process out of order. For example, you wouldn't want to administer the personality test before having the candidates submit their resumes. What stages of the process occur in what order is something you'll want to consider.
Wow, these are all good tips so far. I'm definitely taking mental notes.
Good. So the last part that I want to cover regarding structured interviews is the cost-benefit analysis. As IO practitioners, we are responsible for gathering the most useful information for our clients, while also considering the cost of some of these components. For example, if the best personality test is also the most expensive test on the market, we will have to consider if the client has the financial resources to spend on administering this test to every candidate. We are always finding the balance between delivering what the client wants with what is ethical and realistic. And of course, avoiding these pitfalls are all good talking points and conversations you should have as an IO practitioner when moving candidates through the selection process efficiently. So now that I've covered all of that, let me turn it back over to you, Jen.
Thank you, Kassidy, for going over personal selection tools. Now I'm going to touch on the revolution of performance management. Let's start off by discussing traditional versus modern approaches. Traditional performance management was often rigid, formal, and kind of stressful. Here's how it usually worked. You'd sit down with your manager, maybe once a year, and they'd go through everything you did good and bad. It felt more like a report card than a conversation. Most of the time, your manager would do all the talking, they'd tell you what you need to fix, and that was it. Your voice was not really a part of the process. These reviews often focus on what you weren't doing well, rather than celebrating your strengths, making them feel pretty demotivating. At the end, you will typically get a set of goals for the year, and they wouldn't be adjusted even if your role, the team's priorities, or the company's strategies shifted. This approach resulted in people dreading performance reviews. Managers were overwhelmed, and it didn't really help anyone grow or improve.
Ooh, I'm not a big fan of the traditional approach, and I can't wait to hear more about modern approaches.
I agree. I definitely prefer the modern approaches. Now let me tell you a little more about them. Modern approaches now focus on continuous feedback. So instead of waiting a whole year, feedback happens regularly. The conversations are two-way, making it more collaborative. Employees and managers both have a say, and it feels more like a partnership instead of fixating on weaknesses. The focus is on what you're excelling at and how you can use those strengths to your benefit. It's all about building confidence and motivation. Goals are flexible and aren't set in stone anymore. If priorities change, so do the goals. Coaching is prioritized over criticism. Managers are shifting from being judges to being coaches. They're here to support, guide, and help you grow rather than just pointing out mistakes. This feedback is strongly focused on being developmental.
You know, this makes me think about all the performance reviews I've received in my current and previous roles. I'm glad more companies are shifting towards a more modern approach.
Me too. The traditional approach doesn't seem or feel very effective, but it does make me think about different types of assessments we've encountered in workplaces. Let's go over the most common ones.
Ooh, I'd like to learn more about these.
Perfect. Now that we're familiar with the traditional and modern approaches, I want to briefly touch on 3 of the most common types of performance assessments. We have 360-degree feedback, continuous performance management, and OKRs and KPIs. First up, 360-degree feedback. Think of this as getting a full circle view of your performance instead of just hearing from your manager. You also get feedback from your peers, team members, and sometimes even clients. This works best because it gives a more balanced perspective. You hear from multiple sources, which can help in finding blind spots. Some challenges that come up with this method of feedback are that it may be overwhelming if the feedback isn't handled very well. And it works best in a culture where people are comfortable giving honest and constructive feedback. Next, we have continuous performance management. This approach is all about ongoing check-ins, regular feedback, and staying on track throughout the year. Let us think of it like a coach giving you tips during the game and not just at halftime. You'll have frequent conversations about your progress, challenges, and goals, which makes it easier to adjust and improve. It works because it's dynamic, and you can course correct before small issues become bigger problems, and it builds trust between employees and managers through consistent communication. Some challenges are that it requires time and commitment for managers to stay consistent, and without proper structure, it can become informal and lose its impact.
Those are interesting, but can you remind me what OKRs and KPIs are?
Yeah, sure. OKRs stand for objectives and key results. For example, an objective might be to improve customer satisfaction, and the key result could be to increase positive customer reviews by 20%. KPIs are key performance indicators. These are specific metrics or benchmarks that show how well you're doing, like sales numbers, revenue growth, or website traffic. These work because they're clear and measurable, so you know exactly what success looks like, and they align individual efforts with the company's goals. Some challenges to consider, though, are if the goals aren't set thoughtfully, they can feel like pressure rather than motivation, and people can sometimes focus too much on hitting numbers and forgetting about the bigger picture. It's important to note that these approaches don't have to be used by themselves. A company might use 360-degree feedback for personal growth, continuous performance management for day-to-day improvements, and OKRs or KPIs to keep track of certain goals. The key is to find the right balance and use the method that works best for the company's goals and employees.
Wow, Jen, hearing about these reminds me of when I received a 360-degree appraisal. It was one of the best performance reviews I ever received.
Oh yeah, same here. Now, Kassidy, can you give us some tips for companies starting their assessment journey or looking to improve their assessment practices?
Yeah, sure thing. Keep in mind, this is not a comprehensive list, but this list is a good starting place. Number 1, staff in charge of hiring should come to a consensus on the main qualities they want in a candidate. Number 2, if you're going to utilize any cognitive ability test or personality test, make sure the test is credible. Unfortunately, some of these tests might be really fun to take, but they're not actually scientific and should not be used to make hiring decisions. Number 3, interview questions should be tightly focused to elicit the kind of information the interviewer wants to get. Number 4, choose the right tools. Use tools that align with the purpose, such as the ones Jen mentioned earlier. Examples are 360-degree feedback, continuous performance management, OKRs, and KPIs. Number 5, be constructive and highlight what participants did well and where they can improve with concrete examples and suggest ways participants can grow. Examples are training programs, mentoring, or stretch assignments. Number 6, always make sure that everyone involved on the project agrees what the goals are and are conducting the work ethically. Now, this last point applies to all aspects of I/O and will cut down on massive headaches later, no matter where you work in the field.
Thank you for sharing those, Kassidy. I'll definitely be applying these in the future when I have to build my own assessment or take them into consideration when I conduct interviews. All right. Thank you all for listening. We hope that after today you walk away with more knowledge of workplace assessments.
Stay tuned for our next episode with Monica and Nico, who will be taking a deep dive into training. Goodbye.
Bye.